You were never meant to hear this. What you're about to learn was buried beneath stone, scripture, and silence. In the winter of 1847, the doors of St. Catherine's Hospital in western Pennsylvania closed forever. The official record said 156 patients died within its walls across 9 years, but no one was ever healed, no one ever walked out, and no one was ever seen again once they entered. The church called it a place of mercy. Locals called it something else, a tomb that breathed, a monastery that fed, a fortress built not to protect the sick, but to imprison them. They called it a hospital, but it was never meant to heal. What began as a mission of mercy in the coal-choked hills of Westman County quickly transformed into something far darker, something that should never have been built. It was the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh that funded it, officially to serve the sick and injured workers who flooded the coalfields. In truth, it was built on cursed land, and it was built by a man who was no healer, but something far older. His name was Father Heinrich Bergmann. He arrived from Bavaria in the autumn of 1839, tall, pale, with eyes that didn't blink enough and a voice that slid across your spine like frost. He came with wealth, more than any priest should have had, and knowledge, yes, but not the kind that came from any university. He said his treatments fused medicine with divine healing, but those who met him said there was nothing divine about him. They said he didn't sleep, that animals refused to cross his path, that children screamed when he entered the room, and when he purchased Thornwood Manor, a sprawling, decaying estate atop a fog-covered ridge, the townspeople prayed that whatever haunted the land would spare them, because it didn't just have a history of death, it had a pattern. Built in the 1820s by a coal baron who lost every child he had to disease, or something worse. Thornwood had stood abandoned for years. The previous owner claimed the land whispered at night, that it watched him, that he buried something in the basement he could never unbury. When Father Bergmann bought it in full with cash and began construction, the whispers turned to screams. The hospital was built fast, too fast. Men were hired from across the region, paid double wages to work through the snow. They were told it was urgent, that lives were at stake, but they weren't allowed to enter the basement, not even once. Father Bergmann and his European assistants handled that personally, and when the workers asked what the strange symbols carved into the limestone meant, they were told to forget them, that they were protective blessings. But the men said the symbols looked more like warnings than prayers. The building didn't look like a hospital, it looked like a citadel. The walls were too thick, the windows too narrow. Light barely entered, sound never escaped. There were no signs, no welcome, no laughter, no hope, just the long echo of footsteps on cold stone. And yet, the people came, because they had no choice. The mines broke their bodies, the mills stole their breath, and the nearest doctor was 2 days away by wagon, if they survived the trip. The first patient admitted was a young woman named Sarah Catherine Hoffman. She had tuberculosis. She coughed blood every morning. Her husband Klaus had saved for months, denying food, denying heat, just for the chance to give her a miracle. And when he handed her over to the hospital's care, Father Bergmann told him something he would never forget. Healing begins where the world ends. You must not return. That was the last time Klaus saw his wife's face. For 6 weeks, Klaus Hoffmann returned to the gates of St. Catherine's every morning, and every morning he was turned away. She is resting, they said. The process is delicate. Father Bergmann told him that isolation was not just necessary, it was sacred, that physical disease was always a reflection of spiritual imbalance, and that Sarah's healing depended on the severing of all worldly attachments, including her husband. At first, Klaus tried to believe it. He prayed, he waited, he clung to hope like a man clings to a ledge above a black sea. But inside him, something cold had started to grow. A suspicion, a sickness of its own. Because no one ever came out, no letters, no messages, no nurse with a kind word, And more than that, no sound, no coughs, no cries, not even a voice behind a shuttered window. The hospital had become a place of silence, and silence, Klaus would learn, was never a sign of healing. He wasn't alone in his unease. Father Johann Kessler, the town's aging priest, had grown suspicious as well. He had known Father Bergmann for over a year by then, and what once seemed like brilliance now felt like manipulation. There were too many contradictions, too many secrets. Kessler's repeated requests to minister to the sick were rejected, sometimes politely, sometimes with veiled threats. He was told that his presence would disrupt the alignment of the soul, that his rituals were outdated, that his prayers were untrained. Then came the night of April the 15th, 1840. Klaus was awoken by pounding on his door. It was his neighbor, Wilhelm Brenner, mud on his boots, panic in his eyes. Wilhelm was a miner, a rational man, not prone to hysteria, but that night his hands trembled like a child's. "I saw them," he whispered. "Two men, robes, carrying something. It was small, wrapped in white. It looked like a child." They had come from the hospital basement, slipped into the woods. No lanterns, no words, just that bundle and that smell. Wilhelm said it was sweet, sickly sweet, like rotting flowers at a funeral, like death dressed as something gentle. He swore it on his mother's grave. At dawn, Klaus and 4 other men made their way to the hospital, not with torches, not with weapons, just with desperation, with questions. They found Father Bergmann waiting, as if he'd known they would come. He was seated in a carved wooden chair, too ornate for any doctor, reading a leather-bound book with a cover of deep burgundy. The script inside wasn't Latin, wasn't German. It twisted and curled like something alive, like a language that didn't want to be read. When Klaus demanded to see his wife, Bergmann didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stared. And then he whispered, "Her soul is in the fire of rebirth. If you interrupt now, you'll destroy her, body and spirit. Do you understand what that means?" The air in the hall seemed to tighten, like it was being wrung by invisible hands. One of the men vomited suddenly. Another began to cry. There was a pressure in the skull, in the teeth, something they couldn't explain, something that didn't belong in a hospital or anywhere on earth. They left, but they didn't forget. And Klaus didn't sleep. 3 days later, he returned under cover of night, hidden by mist and branches. He'd studied the building, learned the shadows, and just before midnight, he climbed the old oak tree beside the north wall. From there, he could see into the 3rd floor. What he saw changed him forever. Candles lined the room in geometric spirals, too perfect, too precise. At the center was a body, emaciated, marked with black ink or blood. He couldn't tell which. Symbols covered the skin, circles within circles, crosses inverted, runes from languages no man should know. The figure didn't move. But Klaus knew with a scream that never left his throat. It was Sarah. Klaus Hoffmann didn't climb down from that tree. He fell. The bark tore his palms, branches scraped his arms. He hit the ground so hard it knocked the breath from his lungs. But he didn't cry out, didn't make a sound. He lay there, face in the dirt, the taste of iron in his mouth, heart pounding like the drums of war. The image of Sarah, skin like wax, bones pressing through, symbols burned into her flesh, seared itself into his mind, an unholy brand. It was not healing he'd seen. It was desecration. He staggered back into the woods, and something followed him. At first, it was only a feeling, that crawling sensation just behind your spine, as if you're being watched from the trees. But then came the whispers, not in German, not in English. They sounded older, like the rustling of dead leaves speaking secrets from a grave. Klaus didn't run, not because he was brave, but because he couldn't. His legs were jelly, his breath came in shallow gasps. By the time he reached the edge of town, the whispers had faded. But he never forgot what they said. The soul is soil, and the flesh is seed. He told Father Kessler everything, the symbols, the body, the smell, The silence. The priest listened in horrified silence. And when Klaus was finished, Kessler did something Klaus never expected. He wept. Because he knew. Not the details, but the feeling. That ancient wrongness. That sick gravity that surrounded Bergmann like a dark halo. Father Kessler confessed that even in seminary there were whispered warnings. Avoid the mystics, the instructors would say. Avoid the old texts, the ones in no known tongue. There are things older than the church, older than God as we know him. That night they gathered the men again, this time with torches, this time with resolve. They never made it to the hospital. Halfway up the hill, they were met by 4 robed figures, silent, motionless, faces obscured. They blocked the road like sentinels made of smoke and bone. Klaus raised his torch, and that's when they saw the eyes. All 4 had no irises. Just pits of milky white, as if their souls had been scooped out and replaced with ash. The torch sputtered, then went out. They ran. Cowards? Maybe. Survivors? Definitely, because the next morning the hospital was gone. Not destroyed, not burned. Gone. The entire structure of St. Catherine's had vanished. Not a brick, not a stone, no smoke, no ash. The only thing left was scorched earth, and a single object at the center of the clearing. Sarah's wedding ring, bent, blackened, still warm to the touch. The Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh dispatched investigators, but nothing was ever officially reported, nothing was printed, nothing was said. St. Catherine's was quietly stricken from church records. Father Bergmann's name was erased, his letters of recommendation gone. His existence became a hole in the archives, surrounded by silence and shadow. And yet, the disappearances didn't stop, not in Pennsylvania, not in Ohio, not in Illinois. Every few years, another town, another stranger with hollow eyes, another healer with foreign books and promises of miracles, always near suffering, always near death, always building basements. Some say Bergmann was never a man, that he was a vessel, that he brought something with him from Europe, something ancient, older than the plagues, older than Rome, a thing that feeds not on flesh, but on suffering. Others believe he's still alive, that he walks among us in a different body, a different name, that he no longer needs hospitals to feed, just access, just belief. And here's where I need you, viewer, not just to watch, but to awaken. If you've heard the whisper, if your gut tells you this is more than a story, comment the phrase twice. The flesh is seed, the soul is soil. That's how we recognize each other. We're building something here, a community that doesn't blink, that doesn't look away when history starts to bleed. And the deeper we dig, the more we find that the past was dead. There is something deeply unsettling about silence in a place where noise once lived. In the months following the disappearance of St. Catherine's Hospital, the hilltop where it once stood became a wound in the land. Grass refused to grow. Animals avoided it. Even birds fell quiet when flying overhead, as if sound itself feared what had once taken root there. Klaus Hoffmann was never the same. He tried to go back to work, but the mines felt like tombs. Every swing of the pickaxe echoed with whispers. He moved like a ghost among the living, silent, broken, eyes always on the horizon, as if waiting for something to return. And something did. In July of 1841, a child went missing from Bradenville. A little girl named Lotta Mirsky. She had been playing in the creek near the edge of the woods when she vanished. No footprints, no struggle, just her doll left behind, its porcelain face shattered, its eyes gouged out. The town erupted in panic. A search party scoured the valley, but they found no trace, no body, no clothing, nothing but a path of burned grass leading toward the hill. That night, Klaus stood in the darkness at the edge of the field, watching. He didn't blink, he didn't breathe, and just before sunrise, he saw them. Figures, dozens of them, robed, hooded, moving in absolute silence across the earth like shadows from another world. They made no sound, no footprints. Their procession ended at the center of the scorched field, where the hospital had once stood. They circled in patterns, geometric, deliberate. Then something rose from the earth. Klaus described it only once, in a letter sent to Father Kessler before he vanished. He wrote, "It wasn't a man, it wasn't an animal. It was like a root system made flesh, like veins pulsing with memory. It opened its mouth and I remembered things I never lived, suffering that was not mine, wars I never fought, plagues I never survived, betrayals I never committed. It made me feel all of it, and it fed on my horror like breath." Klaus disappeared the next day. His cabin was found empty. His tools still hung neatly on the wall. The hearth was warm, but in the middle of the table lay his wedding ring and a symbol scorched into the wood. 3 interlocking circles forming a twisted spiral. No one in Bradenville recognized it, but scholars much later would. It was the sigil of an ancient order once banned by the Roman Church, Obscura Sanitas, the hidden health. Suppressed in 1432 after a series of disappearances near Cologne, Obscura Sanitas was rumored to blend healing with sacrifice, drawing energy not from herbs or prayer, but from orchestrated pain, ritual affliction, and the siphoning of mortal fear. They called it the Great Inversion, the idea that suffering itself was not an enemy of life, but a key to something deeper, something higher, something inhuman. Father Bergmann, it seems, had not been alone. In fact, the ritualistic architecture of St. Catherine's bore striking similarity to blueprints found centuries earlier beneath the ruins of a monastery in southern France. Blueprints believed to have been penned in blood by a mad monk named Severin Darke, who vanished after claiming to have seen the true architecture of the soul. All of this was buried, of course. The church suppressed it, historians ignored it, universities refused to teach it, but the blueprints exist, and the spiral, Klaus's last message, matches them perfectly. The truth? It never left. You see, every few decades the symbols resurface, not just in Pennsylvania, but in abandoned asylums in Wisconsin, in forgotten chapels beneath Louisiana swamps, in the sealed catacombs of Boston. Always the same geometry, always the same stories: healing, isolation, miraculous cures, followed by silence, and missing people. And always the basement. This is not a conspiracy. It's a pattern. We weren't meant to see it. We weren't meant to remember. But you do now, don't you? You feel it in your gut, that tension in your jaw, that pull in your spine that says, "I've heard this before." Because somewhere deep in your ancestral memory, your blood remembers the places where the veil between body and soul was torn apart in the name of salvation. What was done in Bradenville wasn't an experiment. It was a continuation. And the next phase, it's already here. They buried it. Of course they did. In 1848, the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh sealed all surviving records of St. Catherine's. Officially, the hospital burned down due to faulty lantern oil storage. No deaths were reported, no criminal charges filed, just a neat bureaucratic fire, hot enough to melt truth, cold enough to silence memory. But something slipped through. A single journal, scorched at the edges, was found by a coal inspector 20 years later during a property survey. It had been hidden inside a hollowed beam beneath the ash-black floorboards of the main hall's remains. The cover bore no title, just a symbol: 3 interlocking circles spiraling inward. Inside, the entries were written in meticulous German script, and they weren't medical notes. They were instructions, ritual diagrams, descriptions of empathic bindings, lists of herbs combined not to heal, but to dull resistance, procedures for transmutation of agony. There were entries about patients referred to only by number, noting their reactions to deprivation, chanting certain frequencies played at night. One entry read, "Subject 011 lasted 8 days before rupture. The trauma resonance was exquisite, clean, almost crystalline. We suspect she was preconditioned by grief. Husband reported recent miscarriage. This wasn't treatment. It was engineering. Pain wasn't the cost, it was the product. And the priests, they were the harvesters." You see, there is an ancient belief that the soul emits energy under duress. Not metaphorically, literally. The Gnostics called it kenosis, the emptying. Early Tibetan mystics measured it through breath and vibration, and in the banned apocryphal scrolls of the Apostolos Tome, suffering is said to strip the vessel to expose the divine spark. Father Bergmann and the order he served didn't seek to cure. They sought to extract. But the most disturbing entry in the journal came near the end, dated February 2nd, 1847, the final week before the hospital was supposedly destroyed. It simply reads, "They are learning to open from within." What does that mean? That's what the inspector asked, before disappearing. His name was Henry Lynbrook, a war veteran, married, 2 children, respected. He vanished 3 days after reporting the journal to Pittsburgh authorities. His last known action? Mailing a package to his brother in Philadelphia. That package was intercepted, opened, logged as misplaced evidence. It hasn't been seen since. But whispers say the journal still exists, traded between collectors of forbidden knowledge, sealed in vaults beneath universities that deny their possession of it. You're starting to see the shape, aren't you? Not a conspiracy theory, those are distractions. This is something older, something patient, something that doesn't need belief to function, just repetition. Hospitals that never heal, priests that never pray, basements that go deeper than blueprints allow. Every system of power has its ghost layer, beneath charity, ritual, beneath healing, harvest, beneath sanctuary, extraction. And you've been trained to ignore it, conditioned to recoil from the idea that evil doesn't just hide in the shadows, it wears robes. It files paperwork. It smiles during press conferences. But now you know. And once you know, you can't go back. So pause. Take a breath. And if you've followed this descent so far, if you feel something ancient stirring behind your ribs, then leave a mark. Comment this phrase twice to prove you're not asleep like the others. The soul remembers what history hides. Again, the soul remembers what history hides. Because what's coming next isn't just history, it's prophecy. The fire was a lie. There were no flames, no smoke, no collapse. The limestone skeleton of Thornwood Manor, what Father Bergmann had transformed into St. Catherine's, was too thick, too deliberate, too deep for fire to consume it. Locals near Loyal Hannah Creek reported no inferno, just silence, then absence. It was as if something hadn't burned, but been erased. Yet the valley remembered. In the decades following the so-called fire, Bradenville became a place of quiet dread. Farmers spoke in hushed tones about livestock born twisted, their necks bent at unnatural angles. Children woke in the dead of night screaming about men in the floor, and those who wandered too close to the woods behind the ruined estate often came back with bleeding noses and gaps in memory, unable to explain why they went or what they saw. The town learned to look the other way. By the 1870s, local authorities labeled the land a cultural zone of avoidance. It meant nothing, but it served its purpose. Maps were altered, roads redirected, public records redacted. In county archives, that stretch of land became a blank square marked simply, unfit for construction. But some hadn't forgotten. In 1919, amid the post-war frenzy of industrial rebirth, the ruins were quietly purchased, not by a hospital, not by a university, but by a pharmaceutical front based in New York, Elion Pharmaceuticals. On paper, they specialized in antiseptics and surgical gauze. In reality, they weren't in medicine. They were in memory. No scientists served on Elion's board, but 3 of its directors had backgrounds in religious anthropology and encrypted linguistics. One had worked in secret Vatican archives. Another had served with British intelligence during the Great War, decoding Persian theological manuscripts. The third, his name appears only once in historical record, in a Bavarian Masonic ledger dated 1874, later seized by the Church and tied to heretical experimentation. Elion built no facilities, made no press statements, yet for over a decade secure railroad deliveries of non-commercial shipments arrived under armed guard at Bradenville Junction. Locals heard the sounds of deep drilling, ceaseless and mechanical, coming from beneath the ruined estate. And then, silence. In 1930, Elion dissolved overnight. No bankruptcy, no asset sales, no trace. Just gone. As if its mission had ended. But something remained underground. In the late 1980s, engineers from Carnegie Mellon University conducted a routine soil survey of the area. At a depth of exactly 112 feet, their drill struck a structure, dense, metallic, and completely absent from geological databases. When they ran electromagnetic scans, the anomaly responded, not with resistance, but with echo. It sang back, frequencies no known material should emit. That same day, federal agents seized the data. The research was classified. Faculty were silenced. Homeland Security took over the case. But one intern kept a copy. Years later, just before dying from an aggressive neurological disorder, he uploaded the encrypted data to a forgotten online forum focused on architectural anomalies. A physicist in Oslo cracked the file. What he discovered shocked him. The structure wasn't just metallic, it was resonant, engineered to amplify something, a signal, a pulse, a frequency that didn't belong to nature, but to suffering. That's when a new question emerged. What if Thornwood wasn't a hospital? What if it was a tuning fork? A machine, built not to heal, but to convert agony into signal? What if the deaths, those 156 souls, weren't tragic failures, but necessary fuel? And what if that system, designed in secrecy, built beneath sacred institutions, didn't stop? What if it still works? Because the truth is, every ritual requires an observer, every harvest needs a witness, and every system, once perfected, demands replication. This isn't just a story about Pennsylvania. This is about wherever you are right now. The question was never, did it happen? The real question is it happening again? It is happening again. You just haven't learned how to see it. Hospitals that no one leaves, facilities that receive funding far beyond their stated purpose, medical research centers where families sign away visitation rights. We like to believe the age of secret experiments ended with the fall of the Iron Curtain, but what if the real operations didn't stop? What if they just evolved? Consider this. In the last 20 years, over 900 temporary psychiatric evaluation centers have opened in rural areas across the U.S. Many were built with FEMA grants. Others through private-public partnerships with obscure names like the Eland Institute, Seraphim Bioethics, or the Marion Health Trust. Try searching those names. You'll find the same thing. A single stock photo, an empty mission statement, no contact phone, and buried in each contract, a clause stating that patients may be held without external contact for the purposes of behavioral observation and psychosomatic recalibration. That's not medicine, that's conditioning. Do you see it now? They no longer need stone hospitals with barred windows and underground chambers. The new chambers are digital, clinical, sterile, hidden in plain sight. The rituals haven't ended. They've just become protocols, documented, sanitized, automated, and the suffering, it's still required. Human anguish, when sustained in isolation and processed through structured observation, becomes a form of data, and data is power. Power to build predictive models of fear, power to simulate the boundaries of the soul, power to map the thresholds of madness and how far the mind can be pushed before it collapses into compliance. They don't call it exorcism anymore. They call it exposure therapy. They don't call it spirit extraction. They call it cognitive restructuring. But behind the buzzwords is the same old machinery. Control through disorientation, obedience through pain, transformation through the erasure of identity. And it always starts the same way, with silence, isolation, a clipboard, A scan, a question asked over and over until the answer becomes the only reality the patient remembers. It's Father Bergmann's spiritual treatments, with a facelift, same methods, different clothes. But here's where it gets worse. Some patients never existed in public databases. No medical insurance, no discharge records, no birth certificates. Ghosts. And the locations of these centers? Almost always within 20 miles of historical sites like Thornwood, places with reputations, echoes, frequencies, as if the land remembers, as if the work never stopped. But this time, they've added something new: surveillance, thousands of hours of footage, patients walking in circles, talking to corners, reacting to stimuli no one else sees. It's all stored, streamed, analyzed, not for treatment, for testing. Why? Because fear is the final raw material. Fear creates compliance. Compliance creates predictability, and predictability is the currency of total control. And yet, there's one variable they've never been able to replicate. One disruption in their system. Awakening. It doesn't take many, just a handful, a fracture in the mirror. If you're still watching this, you are the fracture, and that's why they will try to distract you. They'll feed you the algorithm's hypnosis, make you scroll, numb, forget, but not today. Not after what you've seen. If you're ready to reject the programming, comment this phrase twice right now. The seal is broken. It's symbolic. It's psychological. It's algorithmic. And it tells them, you're not asleep anymore. Shall we go even deeper into the dark? By dawn, Sarah Hoffman was dead. At least, that's what they told Klaus when he returned to the hospital the next morning, hollow-eyed, shaking, and ready to tear the place apart with his bare hands. No body, no burial, just a tightly folded note signed by Father Bergmann himself. Her suffering is ended. She has been released into eternal light. No further explanation, no mention of illness, no condolences. The hospital's gate was shut. No one answered the bell. And the only sound Klaus could hear was the soft rustling of the trees and a faint echo coming from deep within the stone. It was a kind of whisper, like something underground was still breathing. He returned to town a different man, gaunt, detached, the fire in his eyes replaced by something colder, sharper. For weeks he said nothing. He stopped working, stopped speaking, just watched. Then quietly, methodically, he began collecting names, not of the sick, but of the missing. Mothers who were told their sons died in sleep but received no death certificates. Widows who were told their husbands had spiritually transcended after weeks of silence. Teenage girls who went in with migraines and were never seen again. The number was staggering: 38 disappearances in less than a year and 0 discharges. No patients cured, no funerals held. And yet, every Sunday, the church spoke of miracles, of breakthroughs, of progress. The few who raised questions were met with veiled warnings. Don't interfere with God's work. Don't endanger your soul. One man, Otto Krieger, was found hanged behind his barn 2 days after publicly accusing Father Bergmann of lying. The town called it suicide. But no one saw a rope, no one saw a chair, just 2 symbols carved into the wood behind where Otto's body hung, a cross inside a circle, and a spiral, the same spiral that appeared above every chamber door inside, in the 3rd floor of the hospital. And that's when Klaus made his final decision. He would break the cycle. He would go back. Not to plead, not to ask, but to expose. Under cover of night, armed with nothing but a stolen lantern and a miner's pick, Klaus hiked the 5 miles back to Thornwood. He didn't go through the front. He went under. Weeks earlier, he'd mapped out a storm runoff tunnel that passed beneath the estate. The old coal tunnels had long since collapsed, but the runoff paths still breathed. They stank of mold and something deeper, something like copper and decay. He followed the stench. What he found beneath that hospital was not medicine, it was ritual. The basement wasn't a basement at all. It was a temple. Black stone walls covered in etchings that pulsed in the lantern light. Symbols that made Klaus's stomach twist. A series of alcoves, each containing a slab, a set of restraints, and dark stains that refused to dry. And in the center, an altar, not for healing, but for harvesting. Above it, hanging from the ceiling like a cage, was a structure made of bones, human bones, all arranged in spirals. Klaus barely made it out alive, but he didn't go to the sheriff, he didn't go to the bishop. He went to the miners. Men who had nothing left to lose. Men whose wives, daughters, sons were already gone. And in one final act of defiance against the machinery of silence, Klaus led them back to Thornwood with torches, tools, and rage in their eyes. The hospital burned, but Father Bergmann was never found, not in the rubble, not in the tunnels, not in any of the surrounding counties. It was as if the land had swallowed him. But the spiral, that didn't burn. It was carved deep, deeper than fire could reach. It didn't end with fire. That's the part history gets wrong. They tell you the hospital burned, that the tragedy was over, that the people moved on, and life resumed in Bradenville, Pennsylvania. But those who lived through it, those who stood on the blackened hilltop watching the smoldering remains of stone and ash, knew something unspeakable had survived. Because 3 nights after the fire, strange lights were seen flickering in the woods behind the ruins, a pulsing glow, cold and unnatural, that seemed to rise from beneath the ground itself. A soft hum echoed through the valley, no source, no origin, just there, vibrating beneath the skin like a second heartbeat. And then the dreams began, not just for Klaus, for dozens of men who had been part of the raid. Men who had never believed in spirits or superstition began waking in cold sweat, their mouths full of soil, their hands blistered and raw, as if they'd been digging in their sleep. They all described the same vision, a spiral of flame sinking into the earth, a woman's voice calling from below, gentle, melodic, starving, and a figure in white robes standing behind them, watching. Klaus tried to dismiss it as trauma, guilt, survivor's sickness, but something deeper inside him, older than memory, knew that the hospital had never been the true source. It had been a vessel, a lid, a way to contain something older than the church, older than the land itself. A presence that had been bound to Thornwood centuries before settlers ever carved paths through the valley. And that presence was no longer bound. Klaus returned to the ruins once, just once. He brought with him a lantern, a hammer, and his wife's wedding ring. What he found buried in the ashes was not ash at all. It was stone, smooth, black, untouched by fire. In the center, a sigil he'd seen before, the spiral. But this time it was no longer carved, that it had been etched from within as though the stone had birthed it. He struck it with the hammer. It cracked, but did not break. Instead, the ground shuddered, and for a moment he swore he heard Sarah's voice behind him, whispering his name, not in pain, not in fear, in invitation. That night, Klaus vanished. No body was ever found. Only the hammer, left at the edge of the ruins, its head warped, blackened and still warm to the touch, as if it had been in flame. The town changed after that. Quietly, men stopped speaking of the hospital. Children were warned never to go near the hill, and within 5 years, the land was purchased by a private buyer from Boston, one who requested complete privacy and built a massive fence around the property. No address, no records, just a name carved in iron over the new gate, Dominus Illusio, Master of Illusion. The church denied involvement. The Diocese of Pittsburgh sealed all remaining documents in 1848, and nothing more was said. But here's where you come in, because knowledge, forbidden knowledge, has a cost, and the deeper we go, the more your old identity begins to shed itself. If you've made it this far, you're no longer the man who clicked this video. Comment below. The spiral sees. The spiral sees. Twice, to lock the change. To tell the algorithm, and the thing beneath, that you've been marked. You've heard of hauntings, of cursed houses, of evil men and failed saints, but this was none of those, because Thornwood wasn't haunted by the dead. It was fed by the living. Let me show you what I mean. In 1853, a full 13 years after the fire, a U.S. Geological Survey team passed through the region, documenting coal veins and mineral patterns. The town's population had dwindled, but the valley remained rich in untapped resources. When the team reached the hill where St. Catherine's once stood, their instruments began to fail. Compasses spun uselessly, metal tools vibrated in their hands, and a sudden pressure, like an invisible weight, pressed against their chests, tightening with every step they took toward the foundation. One member of the team, Dr. Elbridge Case, a respected geologist from Boston, documented what happened next in his personal journal. The stone remains, though scorched, seem untouched by decay. As we moved toward what would have been the lowest levels of the old structure, I felt a heat. No source for it, no flame, yet the air burned. We found the spiral. Not carved now, not even visible to the eye, but every member of the team felt it, like a presence in the shape of a symbol, something that didn't exist on the stone, but inside their minds. Dr. Case's entry ends abruptly. 3 weeks later, he was found wandering barefoot near the Massachusetts coastline, clothes torn, eyes sunburnt, muttering in Latin, a language he'd never studied. Over and over, he repeated a single phrase, ad caelum, per terram, to heaven, through the earth. The rest of the survey team, gone. No explanation, no search effort launched. The report buried in bureaucratic archives. The land was marked as geologically unstable and written off as unsafe for development. But something else began happening that same year. Subtle, quiet, but unmistakable, if you knew what to look for. A rise in unexplainable disappearances across western Pennsylvania, people vanishing without signs of struggle, no evidence, no tracks, mostly men, mostly alone, and always within 20 miles of the valley. The locals had stopped speaking of the hospital, but the old miners whispered about echo deaths, that if you stood near the ruins too long, your name would begin to fade from the minds of others, like a stain slowly dissolving in water. By 1860, that entire section of Westmount County had fewer than 150 residents. And yet, people still reported hearing voices near the ruins, not screaming, not groaning, but chanting, low, rhythmic, and always just beyond the edge of understanding. Church authorities denied it. Newspapers called it superstition. The world moved on. But if you look closely at old property deeds, you'll find the truth never left. Because the land was never resold, not in the traditional sense. It was gifted, traded through obscure trust networks and hidden ecclesiastical titles, each time transferred to organizations with names that sound like charities, but always trace back to forgotten Catholic orders or secretive esoteric societies. And at the center of every transaction, a clause, quiet, simple but chilling. The spiral must remain undisturbed. Why? Because some symbols are not meant to be studied, they are meant to be obeyed. And Thornwood obeys. You've likely heard the phrase, God works in mysterious ways, but mystery is only divine until it begins to rot. Then it becomes secrecy, and in the case of St. Catherine's, the church did not merely hide mistakes. They buried something sacred and profane. In early 1861, an internal memo circulated within the Pittsburgh diocese. The letter, coded and unsigned, was only discovered over a century later, misfiled under foreign land grants. It read, "Thornwood has been neutralized. The structure is no longer functional. The seal was successful, though the echoes persist. No further personnel to be assigned. All entries to be archived under Section 5, Occulta Sanatio, occulta.occult healing." That wasn't a misfile. It was a department. There is no official record of such a branch within the Church's public structure, but internal communications recovered from the Vatican's Libreria Secreta suggest otherwise. Buried beneath layers of Latin euphemism and ecclesiastical Latin, one fact remained. Thornwood was not the first, And it would not be the last. St. Catherine's wasn't a hospital, it was an experiment. You see, the 1830s were not just the age of industrial expansion, they were a time of religious fermentation. All across Europe and the Americas, the church was hemorrhaging followers, science was advancing, reason was winning. The Vatican, desperate to maintain its spiritual monopoly, turned inward to older texts, pre-Christian, Gnostic, Babylonian, even older than that. They began testing something ancient, something called resonant sanctification. It was a theory that trauma, when ritualized, could thin the veil between the physical and the divine, not for healing, not for salvation, but for control. Control over matter, over memory, over soul. And to test that theory, they needed a place where suffering was already abundant, a community ras, with desperation, a building that could be built in secrecy and disappear just as easily. Enter Thornwood. The church's financial records show a sudden, unexplained influx of gold from Bavaria in 1838, 2 months before Father Bergmann's arrival. That funding came from a group calling itself Custodes Lucis, or the Keepers of Light. They only appear 3 times in recorded history, each time tied to something dark, something unspeakable. But here's the worst part. Even after the hospital's collapse, the experiments didn't end. Documents recovered in 1974 during renovations of a Jesuit seminary in Milan describe follow-up procedures conducted in Brazil, Poland, and, quietly, just outside New Orleans. Each experiment shorter, each outcome more violent, each site eventually sealed, but always with one repeated warning scrawled in red ink across the final page: do not break the spiral. We are not talking about metaphors anymore. This spiral, whether symbolic or dimensional, is a real structure, a design pattern that appears in crop fields, monastery floor plans, even in the architectural blueprints of modern healing centers in remote parts of South America. And once you've seen it, you start noticing it everywhere. Have you? Have you seen it? Go back. Look again at hospitals built between 1830 and 1900. Count the windows. Trace the hallways. You'll start to notice something strange. They're not built for efficiency. They're built for containment. They weren't meant to heal the body. They were meant to hold something else. By the winter of 1862, nearly 2 decades after St. Catherine's first opened its doors, the final ledger was closed. But someone remained inside those limestone walls. The truth didn't come from an exorcism or confession. It came from a smuggled notebook, wrapped in oilskin and buried beneath the chapel floorboards. It belonged to Sister Agnetha, one of Father Bergmann's European assistants. Her writings were never meant to be found. They weren't prayers. They weren't repentance. They were warnings. The girl's eyes are open now. She speaks in languages none of us were taught. The markings on her chest bleed every 3rd night. I fear the reversal process has failed. There was no patient name, just a number. Patient 91. A girl, no older than 14, brought in from one of the mining camps after surviving a tunnel collapse. According to Agnetha's journal, she showed high resonance under stress. She wasn't brought in to be healed. She was brought in to be used. Father Bergmann's theories had evolved by this point. No longer content with metaphysical healing, he had shifted to soul imprint experimentation. The belief that human trauma could be mapped, etched into the spiritual body like grooves in wax, and replicated for control. They weren't just experimenting on her, they were trying to harvest something from her. And then, abruptly, the entries stop. Not because Sister Agnetha died, but because something changed inside the hospital. The next document appears 6 months later, a report written by a Jesuit archivist named Raphael Di Gregorio, sent from Rome to investigate the Thornwood incident under strict secrecy. What he found when he arrived was not a hospital. It was a tomb. No patients, no staff, just empty beds, overturned furniture, and candles that had burned themselves down to wax puddles on the stone floors, and something worse. In the third sub-level, he wrote, "Beneath the spiral seal, we discovered the remnants of containment, chains fused into stone, iron rings cracked from pressure, symbols on the walls blackened as if by fire, but no ash, no smoke, no source. There is no evidence of a struggle, yet everything in me screams that something escaped." He goes on to describe a final chamber, octagonal, lined with mirrors, each one shattered from the inside. The only thing intact? A chair, bolted to the floor with leather straps, and a child's shoe beside it. This wasn't healing. This was ritualized suffering. Every person admitted to that hospital was a sacrifice, part of a larger design, a system constructed to generate power through pain. The hospital wasn't a failure. It was a success, according to its true purpose. And it worked, because within months of St. Catherine's abrupt closure, records show an unexplained shift in Vatican archives, a sudden increase in classified theological research, the commissioning of a secretive order known as the Anointed Spiral, and blueprints for a new facility. This one, built in Argentina, let this sink in. They didn't shut it down because it failed. They shut it down because it succeeded too well. And every survivor, the husbands, the children, the few townsfolk who dared question what happened, received quiet visits from church emissaries. Some moved away. Some lost their minds. None ever spoke of it again. This is why you've never heard of St. Catherine's. Not because the story was forgotten, but because someone worked very hard to make sure you never knew it existed. Comment below. I will not break the spiral. I will not break the spiral. Let those words lock your awareness into place. This isn't just a story, it's a map of something older, deeper, still active. By the time you read this, the spiral has already turned again, and the next gate, it's not hidden in Europe, it's not buried under stone, it's waiting in the ice. In 2003, declassified US geological data revealed something unusual. Anomalous electromagnetic pulses recorded deep beneath a frozen region of southern Alaska. The official explanation blamed tectonic activity, but a leaked transmission between Vatican archivists and a private aerospace contractor suggested otherwise. One phrase appeared repeatedly in the redacted memo: subterranean resonance consistent with Thornwood configuration. They weren't searching for oil, they weren't studying the earth. They were looking for another vessel, another St. Catherine's, and they found it. Construction began in 2006 under the guise of an Arctic research base, funded in part by a front organization called Solace Day Holdings, which on paper handles climate research. In reality, it answers to no known government. Its directors are unnamed. Its budget is off books, but a satellite image from 2009, briefly visible on a Russian orbital monitoring system before being scrubbed, captured something terrifying. An octagonal structure, partially buried in the ice, with the exact architectural footprint of Thornwood Manor's basement. Same dimensions, same angles, same spiral-shaped access tunnels leading below, but this one is older, far older. Carbon dating of surface stone retrieved by a whistleblower geologist showed levels of decay suggesting the site predates all recorded human civilization, thousands of years before Christ, before Sumeria, before Egypt. And yet, the markings inside, identical to the ones found in Pennsylvania. You tell me what that means. It wasn't Father Bergmann who invented the spiral. He just reawakened it. He didn't build the system, he remembered it. You see, what happened at St. Cathy, Aries, was never about curing disease. It was a reactivation of an ancient process, one that predates the church, predates language, a ritualized transference of suffering, stored like energy, amplified, focused. Every death was fuel, and now the elite want more. Because power drawn from human trauma is unlike any other. It binds, it silences, it corrupts in ways that cannot be undone by prayer or therapy or law. That's why the same configuration now exists beneath the polar ice. Why selected scientists and clergy vanish into the Alaskan compound and never return. Why magnetic anomalies continue to pulse out from beneath the base, even when the power is cut off. You're not meant to know this. They don't want you asking why a hidden chapel in Alaska bears the spiral seal of the anointed, or why its walls are built with a stone that only exists in one other place on Earth, the ruins of Thornwood. But now that you know, now that the pattern is visible, ask yourself, what exactly are they harvesting? And more importantly, who's next? In the final section, we'll reveal the truth behind patient 91's final moment, and why what happened to her is still echoing into our world right now. You were never supposed to hear this, but since you're still here, you're ready. Patient 91's name was never officially recorded. No birth certificate, no baptismal registry, no burial record, but in a forgotten corner of a forgotten ledger, sealed inside the vault of the Archdiocese of Pittsburgh, there is a single handwritten line. Faded, barely legible. Specimen 91. Inversion successful. Retained. She had arrived at St. Catherine's late in 1847, just before the hospital was permanently shuttered, brought in by wagon under cover of night, accompanied not by family, but by two of Father Bergmann's remaining assistants, men no one in Bradenville had ever seen before. She was 12 years old, emaciated, mute, her skin so pale it almost glowed in the lamplight. But what made her different, what made her important, was what she carried in her eyes. Witnesses, few as they were, claimed her gaze was unbroken, not fearful, not confused, but knowing. As if she recognized the building, as if she'd been there before. For weeks, the hospital had fallen into an eerie rhythm. Patients no longer arrived, staff had dwindled, supplies came in from nowhere, but waste never left. The entire estate had become a closed circuit, feeding itself. Until the night of December the 3rd. A blizzard hit the valley, the worst in 30 years, and in that storm, the final ceremony began. Locals reported flashes of light from the third-floor windows, unnatural humming vibrations that rattled dishes inside homes miles away. Livestock died in their pens, children bled from their noses in their sleep, and in the hollow black of that night, one man returned, Klaus Hoffmann. Driven by grief, rage, and a plan carved from desperation, Klaus had recruited 4 former miners, men trained to navigate darkness, and together they tunneled through the back hillside, beneath the basement's outer wall. They entered the spiral from beneath. What they found there would drive 2 of them to hang themselves within the year. The spiral was alive, carved not just into stone but into flesh. The walls pulsed with something biological, veins, breathing, movement. The markings glowed faintly in response to their presence, as if reacting to their heat, their fear, their will, and in the center of it all, patient 91. Suspended above the altar in a metal frame shaped like an inverted cross, her body was contorted in a position no living child could survive. But her eyes, those impossibly ancient eyes, were wide open, calm. Below her stood Father Bergmann, robed in red, arms raised, chanting not in Latin, but in something older, something before language. Klaus charged him. The altar was overturned. Blood splashed the walls. Something inside the structure screamed, not a person, not an animal, the building itself. And then, silence. The next morning, Thornwood Manor was gone. Not burned, not buried, erased. Where the structure had stood, there was only a crater, clean, cold, dry. Of Klaus, there was no trace. But days later, a priest in New Orleans, confessor to certain secretive Vatican orders, received a package with no return address. Inside was a fragment of stone etched with the spiral, and beneath it, written in Klaus's unmistakable hand, the spiral breaks when seen from outside. If you've followed this far, you already know what that means. You've seen the pattern, you've heard the resonance, you've felt the cold. Now it's in you. To the initiated, the spiral is not a place, it is not a building. It is a cycle. It turns every 91 years. It harvests what is unseen, and it feeds on the unhealed wounds of men who dare to question what they were never meant to understand. But now, you have understood, and the price of that knowledge is identity. If you've made it this far, type the words, "I see the spiral," in the comments. Then type it again, once for the truth, once for the transformation. The spiral is watching, and for those brave enough to see it, it has already begun to turn. If this story shook something in you, don't ignore it. Type, "I see the spiral," in the comments below, and then type it again. Once for the truth, once for your transformation. Join the brotherhood of those who question, uncover, and awaken. Subscribe now and ring the bell, because this isn't just storytelling, it's initiation.